The city bus hit a pothole, bouncing sharply, and Elena clutched the bag on her lap. It was a reflex, as if she were carrying something fragile. In reality, she was carrying almost nothing. A change of underwear, a toothbrush, a paperback she probably wouldn't even open, and a bag of apples. The nurse on the phone had said fresh fruit was allowed. It was a small bag, almost comical for the place. She was going for surgery, for general anesthesia, with the lingering possibility of not waking up. She stared out the window. Oakhaven in late November. The gray linden trees lining Main Street were stripped bare to their very last leaves. The morning, puddles, once glazed with a thin film of ice, were now shattered by midday traffic. There was the faint smell of wood smoke from the chimneys on the outskirts of town and the aroma of fresh bread from the corner bakery. Elena knew this Midwestern city by heart. She was born here, grew up here, and had taught elementary school here for 10 years. She knew every crack in the asphalt, every back alley, but now, looking out at the familiar brick facades, she felt something resembling a farewell. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but quiet and calm. What if this was the last time? Her surgeon had been an honest man. He didn't try to scare her, but he didn't offer empty promises either. He'd said, "The tumor is benign, but surgery is surgery, and there are always risks. Complications from anesthesia." He had looked her right in the eye, and she respected him for that, even though, in that exact moment, she had wished with all her heart that he would lie to her. Just a little, the first thought that came to her, when the reality truly sank in, not in her head, but somewhere deeper, wasn't about Greg, her husband of 8 years. She thought about her second-grade class, about Tommy, who had finally started reading fluently without stumbling over his words, about Chloe with her perpetually untied shoelaces and sharp little tongue, about little Danny, who had cried his eyes out on the first day of September, but now sprinted into the day's classroom first thing every morning. She wondered who would explain the conjugations of verbs to them, who would wait for Danny by the door. That said a lot about her 8-year marriage. Probably everything. They had gotten married when she was 24. Greg Vance was a dazzling man back then. The kind who filled a room without even trying. A booming laugh, sweeping gestures, a sheer self-confidence that a young Elena had mistaken for strength. Her mother, Linda, a seamstress with 30 years of experience and tired, calloused fingers, had warned her, "Be careful, Ellie. Loud men are usually only loud on the outside." Elena hadn't listened. She was young and assumed her mother just didn't know how to be happy for other people. The bliss lasted about 1.5 years. After that, things weren't exactly bad. That was important to understand. There were no screaming matches, no physical abuse, nothing she could confide to her girlfriends over wine to garner their absolute sympathy. It was something else. His leather recliner, always planted dead center in the living room, as if intentionally taking up the most space. Her belongings, which somehow, always, found themselves pushed to the margins. Her books relegated to the bottom shelf, her winter coat on the hook pressed flat against the wall, her weekend plans, always slightly less important than his. It wasn't discussed. It simply happened. They had no children. Greg would say, "It's not the right time. Money's tight. You're still young." Every year he found a new excuse. At first, Elena believed him. Then she stopped believing, but she kept waiting. She waited until the Proust waiting became a habit, and the habit became the background noise of her life. Over the last 2 years, he had started coming home late. Work, he'd say. Meetings, clients. She didn't ask questions. Not because she was afraid of the answers, though that was part of it, but because she had forgotten how to demand explanations. It happens gradually, imperceptibly. One day, you decide not to start a conversation because you're too tired. The next, because you don't want an argument. And, suddenly, you realize you haven't asked him anything in a very long time, and that has become your normal. 3 weeks ago, when she came home with her test results and told him she needed urgent surgery, that the specialist was insisting on it, Greg didn't even look up from his iPhone. Well, get the surgery then. It's elective, not life or death, he said, and went right back to scrolling. She had gone to the surgical consultation alone. She booked the appointment, showed up, listened, signed the consent forms. She packed her small bag alone, too. This morning, she called an Uber to the hospital because Greg had left even earlier. An important meeting. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried over him in a very long time. She just picked up her bag and walked out of the condo. The hospital was downtown, a 3-story building from the 70s, its exterior updated with modern vinyl siding, but its interior still smelling of time, linoleum, bleach, and the dim fluorescent light of its corridors. Mercy. General. Elena checked in at the admissions desk, handed over her ID and insurance card, and was given a room number. The intake nurse, an older woman with a kind, exhausted face, was flipping through the paperwork when she suddenly stopped. "Elena Vance," she said, looking slightly apologetic. Her badge read Valerie Higgins. "We have a slight problem. We're completely out of private rooms on the Prusendack surgical floor today. You'll be in a semi-private room. There's already a patient there, a man, but he's very..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Quiet. He promised not to be a bother." Elena looked at her. "That's fine," she said. What else was she supposed to say? Valerie sighed with relief, as if she had been expecting an argument, and handed her a hospital gown and a plastic admission bracelet. The room was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall. 2 hospital beds, 2 bedside tables, and a window overlooking the hospital courtyard, where a lone bench sat next to a bare rosehip bush, stripped down to its bright red berries. The bed near the door was made and empty, waiting for her. In the bed, by the window, a man was reading a book. Not a phone, but a real, physical paperback with a creased spine. He looked up when she walked in. He was in his early 40s, dark hair graying at the temples. His face was brine, calm, not cold, but distinctly calm. He had a direct gaze, lacking that awkward fidgetiness people get when they are caught in a somewhat vulnerable situation. He looked at her naturally. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she replied, and began unpacking. "Hiabe," they introduced themselves. His name was Andrew Harrison. Hers was Elena. Nothing more was said, and that felt right. There was no awkwardness, no desperate attempts to fill the silence. He went back to his book. She settled onto her bed and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was entirely ordinary, white, with a small hairline crack near the window that looked like a river. Elena stared at the crack and thought, Tomorrow morning they will wheel me into the OR, put a mask over my face, ask me to count to 10, and I might not even get the chance." The fear was physical, It sat right under her ribs and occasionally crawled up her throat. Outside, it got dark early. It was November. After all, the rosehip berries on the bush turned almost black in the twilight. She didn't sleep that night. It wasn't surprising. She had been sleeping poorly, at home for weeks, waking up at 3 or 4 in the morning gripped by an anxiety she couldn't name. Now, the anxiety had a name and a date. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., operating table. The room was quiet. Occasionally, a car would drive by outside, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. Andrew Harrison lay in his bed. Judging by his breathing, he wasn't asleep either. It was too steady, too conscious. "Are you scared?" he asked into the dark. His voice was deep. It wasn't really a question, more an acknowledgement of the obvious. Elena stayed quiet for a moment. "Yes," she answered. Silence. Then he said, "I was scared too. 3 years ago, when I was truly sick." He didn't elaborate on what he had, and Elena didn't ask. In the dark of the hospital room, those words existed entirely separate from their medical context. What mattered was something else. Not the story itself, but the fact that he said it out loud. That he didn't pretend everything was perfectly fine. That he didn't offer a hollow, "Don't worry, everything will be okay," the way people do, when they have no idea what to say. "Did it pass?" she asked softly. "It passed," he confirmed. And nothing more. Elena closed her eyes. She still couldn't sleep, but the anxiety shifted, slightly. It didn't vanish, no, but it became a little less piercing, as if it had been sliced in half. It was a bizarre feeling. A man she hardly knew was lying in the bed next to hers. They had exchanged exactly 5 sentences all day, and yet she felt less lonely than she had for years sleeping next to her husband. She didn't want to think about that anymore. She just lay there, listening as the first early snow began to fall outside. She couldn't see it, but she could hear it in the way the sounds of the city changed. It grew softer, muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in cotton. In the morning, her phone woke her up. Not a ringtone, but the buzz of a text message. It had come in during the night while she was dozing in brief, fitful spells. She picked up the phone mechanically, assuming it was from her mother, who knew nothing about the surgery and whom Elena hadn't wanted to worry. No. The screen lit up with the name, Greg. Elena read it. "We're getting a divorce. I don't need you, especially not sick. I'm not paying a dime out of pocket for this. You have your school district insurance. My lawyer is already drafting the papers. Don't call me." Elena read it again. And again. The letters didn't change. 8 years. 8 years of waking up earlier than him, managing the household, splitting the mortgage right down the middle, and sometimes paying more when he was between commissions. 8 years of waiting for the children he kept postponing. 8 years of telling herself, "It's fine, things will get better, it just takes time, just a little more patience." And now, on the morning of her surgery, a text message, "Don't call me." She didn't realize she was crying until the phone screen blurred and she felt the tears streaming silently down her face. And then something inside her snapped, and she couldn't stop them. Her shoulders shook. She pressed the phone to her chest and bent forward in half. Not from physical pain, but from what? The thing that had no name. From the weight of those 8 years crashing down on her all at once. From the fact that he hadn't even had the decency to call. From the fact that she was sitting here completely alone, with her tiny duffel bag and her apples, 2 hours before they were supposed to wheel her in to be cut open. And the only thing her closest person had to say was, "Don't call me." Andrew didn't get up immediately. He gave her a second, clearly sensing that there was no need to rush. Then he sat up, took a plastic cup of water from his bedside table, and set it on the tray near her bed. He pulled up a chair, not on her bed, on the chair. Respectfully. It's how you sit next to someone when you want to be near, but refuse to cross a boundary. "What happened?" he asked quietly. She couldn't speak. She just handed him the phone. She watched as he took it, read the screen, and handed it back. His face revealed absolutely nothing, not in the sense of indifference, but a very specific kind of restraint, the kind where a person consciously refuses to let their emotions breach the surface. Only his jaw muscles twitched slightly. "Can the surgery be postponed?" he asked. "No," she replied, realizing her voice was working again. Shaky, but working. "Dr. Sterling said we can't wait. The tumor is small now, but its growth rate." She trailed off. Andrew nodded. He just sat beside her in the silence. He was just there. And that turned out to be profoundly important. He didn't try to comfort her with cliches, didn't promise everything would be fine, didn't pry with pointless questions. He just sat in the chair and remained present. A few minutes later, an orderly arrived to take him down for his pre-op prep. The orderly was brisk and all business. "Andrew Harrison, 20 minutes. Be ready." He stood up and grabbed his hoodie from his nightstand. Elena was still sitting on the edge of her bed. The tears had mostly stopped, but inside, she was left with that hollow sensation that follows a violent bout of weeping when everything feels simultaneously scrubbed clean and utterly empty. She looked at him, tall, quiet, with his creased paperback left on his pliant nightstand, and suddenly said something, surprising even herself, with a fine bitterness that cut through the remnants of her tears and sounded almost like a laugh. "You're such a decent man. Not like my husband. If I survive this, we should get married." She fully expected a polite smile, or a soft, "You're going to be fine," or a joking, "It's a deal," or perhaps, "Let's just focus on getting you better." Any of the standard reactions smart, kind people use to deflect a bitter joke. He stopped. He looked at her. Not for a second, but a little longer. Seriously, and he nodded. "Okay," he said. The orderly was already rolling a wheelchair into the hallway. Andrew walked out. The door clicked shut. Elena stared at the closed door. She was almost certain he had just played along, that this was his way of saying, "Hang in there. You'll make it. I believe in you." Normal human encouragement. She was almost certain. Almost. They came for her exactly at 8. A different nurse. Young, with bright acrylic nails, moving fast. Her badge read Chrissy Weaver. She briskly checked the plain wristband on Elena's arm and said, "Let's roll." The gurney glided down the corridor. Elena lay on her back, staring at the proselyous ceiling. Fluorescent lights drifted past, the seams in the acoustic tiles, more lights, a turn, double doors. The ore smelled of chilled air and sterile metal. The surgeon, Dr. Lawrence Sterling, whom Elena had met at her consult, was already there. An older, fit man with a quiet voice and incredibly steady hands. He looked down at her and said, "You're going to do great, Elena." The anesthesiologist brought the mask over her face. Deep breaths. Start, counting backward from 10. Elena closed her eyes. She didn't count. Her very last thought, already slipping, away before everything turned white and then plummeted into black, was the rosehip bush outside the window of her hospital room, the bright red berries on, the naked branches, and the promise she made to herself that if she woke up, the first thing she would do was look out that window. The darkness came softly, like snow. She woke up to a deep, aching pain. Not a sharp stab, but a profound, hollow ache, as if someone had rearranged vital pieces of her interior, and I couldn't find their proper places anymore. Elena opened her eyes and saw a white ceiling. Not the ore ceiling. A different one, with a crack like a river near the dawn. Window. Back in her room. It meant it was over. She woke up. That first, simplest realization, I am alive, was so overwhelming that for a few seconds she simply lay there, inhaling and exhaling. It hurt, but that didn't matter. It was a good pain. The pain of a living human being. Almost immediately, Nurse Valerie appeared, as if she had been hovering nearby. "Welcome back, sweetie. You did wonderfully." She adjusted the IV drip and checked something on the chart. The surgery was a complete success. Dr. Sterling did flawless work. The tumor was completely removed. She paused for a fraction of a second. "Your reproductive organs were preserved." She said that last part quietly, with a special tone. Not clinical, but humane, as if she understood that this was exactly the second thing Elena needed to hear, right after you are alive. Elena closed her eyes. Relief flooded her body in a warm wave, from her chest, down to her fingertips. She didn't cry. She just lay there, breathing. And then she thought, what now? The text message hadn't vanished. It was still on her phone, lodged in the Pristidt court. Memory of those 8 years which had suddenly been revealed for exactly what they always were. Wasted time. She opened her eyes and looked at the neighboring bed. Andrew had been brought back earlier. His surgery was routine and shorter. He was lying near the window, staring out at the gray Midwestern sky. When Elena's gurney had been rolled in, he turned his head. "How are you?" he asked. "Alive. Good," she said simply. And in that brief, unvarnished good, there was something entirely genuine. No forced politeness. She actually meant it. Elena felt it, and marveled at how easy it was to feel. She spent most of the first day sleeping. The anesthesia wore off sluggishly, reluctantly, leaving behind a thick fog of drowsiness and a mild sense of unreality. Andrew didn't bother her. Whenever she opened her eyes, she saw that he was either looking out the window or just lying there with his eyes closed. He was present without words, without noise, without that overbearing fussiness. That is usually more about the person doing the fussing than the person in the fight. In the evening, they brought her chicken broth. She ate half of it. "There's half left," Andrew noted from behind his book. It was an observation, not an order. "I can tell," she replied, and finished the broth. He turned to BlangNewmanDay.com's page. The next day, Chrissy appeared. Elena recognized her, the same nurse with the Somme dye acrylics who had wheeled her into the OR. Brisk, sharp. Now she walked into the bay. Skrisk, Hauter, room with the demeanor of someone executing a task she didn't particularly enjoy. She stopped at Elena's bed, looking down with an unreadable expression. Not sympathetic. More evaluative. "Your husband called," Chrissy said. "He said he's stopping by the condo to grab some of his things and that you shouldn't try to call him. Elena just looked at her. Okay. Chrissy lingered for a second, as if expecting a different reaction, then turned on her heel and walked out. Silence in the room. Then Andrew lowered his book. Do you know what your husband does for a living? It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elena didn't answer right away. She stared at the ceiling, thinking. Greg had been at this very hospital about a month ago. He told her it was for work, supposedly pitching to a medical supplier or something. He'd been in medical sales for the last year. She hadn't really paid attention. He told her he had been here twice. The puzzle assembled itself without any effort. The final piece clicked into place, and the picture was painfully clear. I think I do now, Elena said, her voice perfectly flat. Andrew didn't add anything else, and that was the right thing to do. Toward noon, Nurse Valerie came in for her standard rounds. Injections, blood, pressure, meticulous notes on the tablet. She was thorough, exact. The kind of veteran nurse who never mixed up a chart or missed a detail. Elena had already grown quite fond of her, something akin to trust. As she finished an injection and disposed of the syringe, Valerie suddenly froze. She looked at Elena, shot a brief, almost guilty glance at Andrew, and looked back at Elena. Ellie, she began cautiously. Do you realize who is sharing your room? Elena glanced at the neighboring bed. Andrew was flipping through his paperback, with the serene composure of a man completely deaf to the conversation. Although, in a room this small, being deaf to it was physically impossible. Andrew Harrison, Elena said. You don't understand. Valerie dropped her voice to a harsh whisper, even though whispering was entirely pointless. That's the Harrison. He owns commercial real estate in 7 different states. That massive tech firm out in Silicon Valley, and God knows what else in New York. He's one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest. And on the East Coast, a calm voice rang out from the bed by the window. Valerie snapped her mouth shut. Andrew lowered his book to his lap and looked at her. Not hostile, just steady, unblinking. Thank you, he said. That was a very comprehensive briefing. Valerie flushed bright red, mumbled something under her breath, grabbed her tray, and practically fled the room. Elena looked at Andrew. He opened his book again. Did you hear that? She asked. Yes. And? And nothing. He turned a page. It's just data. That evening, she finally asked him. They had grown accustomed to talking at dusk, when the clatter in the hallway died down and the overhead lights were dimmed. Outside, the last gray reflections of the short winter day were fading. It was an hour practically engineered for honesty. Why are you here? Elena asked. In this county hospital. In this city. You could have gone anywhere. I know. He nodded. Dr. Sterling is the best board-certified surgeon in the country for abdominal adhesions. He left Johns Hopkins a few years ago and refuses to go back. If you want the best result, you come to Ohio. But a semi-private room? A pause. They were out of private suites, he said. So I agreed to a shared room. Why didn't a man of your, she searched for the word, means, just wait? Or pull strings? Andrew remained silent, a beat longer than usual. I don't like being alone, he finally said. His voice was level, but there was something in it. Something that suggested he rarely admitted this out loud. Alone in hotels, alone in the car, alone in a massive house. Here, at least, there is another living, breathing, human being nearby. He turned his head slightly toward the window. Elena didn't reply. Some things don't require an answer. On the third day, she brought up the thing she had been turning over in her mind since she woke up. Andrew. He looked up. Do you remember what I said before the surgery? About getting married. You nodded. Were you serious? He set his book down and looked her right in the eye, without a trace of downs of dim mockery. Yes, he said. You're out of your mind. Probably. Elena stared at him. I'm not ready, she said. I'm still legally married. I'm coming off heavy painkillers. I know absolutely nothing about you, other than the fact that you read physical books and you hate being alone. I know, he replied calmly. I'm in no rush. It was exactly that the fact that he didn't push, didn't try to persuade her, wasn't rushing her that disarmed her completely. She was used to men who either bulldozed their way to what they wanted through sheer persistence or gave up entirely. And he simply said, I'm in no rush. And suddenly, she felt like she had time, like she actually had a choice. It had been a long, long time since she had felt that way. The days in the hospital fell into a quiet, almost cozy rhythm. For the first 2 days, Elena wasn't allowed out of bed, except to shuffle to the bathroom, with the nurse's help. It was humiliating, but only exactly as much as necessary. No more, no less. Then she was allowed to sit up, then to take careful laps around the room. The pain receded slowly, like floodwaters pulling back. Sometimes it felt like it was gone, and then a wave would crest again. Andrew recovered much faster. His surgery had been less invasive. By the third day, he was pacing the hallway with a smooth, unhurried stride. Sometimes, he would bring back a cup of herbal tea from the vending machine down the hall and simply leave it on her nightstand without asking. She didn't thank him, and that was perfectly fine too. They had formed a silent pact not to turn basic, human decency into an event. She told him about her students, not because she had nothing else to talk about, but because they were her world, and she was used to thinking out loud about them, about Tommy, who had finally cracked his phonics and now brought books from home, carrying them with the pride of an author holding a first edition, about Chloe, with her perpetually untied laces and her uncanny ability to say exactly what every adult in the room was thinking, but too polite to voice. About Danny, who had sobbed at the classroom door in September, but by November was fiercely debating anyone who would listen over who would win in a fight, dinosaurs or robots, and he accepted no counter-arguments. Andrew listened in a way she had never seen an adult man listen. He didn't check his phone. He didn't put on that mask of polite attention that secretly translates to, I am waiting for you to stop talking. He just listened. He watched her, occasionally offering a barely perceptible smile, sometimes asking a highly specific question, as if he truly wanted to understand the mechanics of her world, rather than just fill the silence. In 8 years, Greg had never once asked her the name of a single student. The comparison arose on its own, effortlessly, and Elena thought, there it is, right there. It's not in the money, or the looks, or some special charisma. It's the fact that one man looks at me when I speak, and the other never did. He told her about Vera on the 4th evening, not all at once, but gradually, like climbing a staircase. First, he mentioned he used to live in New York. Then, that he was married. He stopped, and Elena didn't rush him. Her name was Vera. She was an artist. Quiet, he added. And in that one word, quiet, there was so much warmth that Elena understood it wasn't an adjective. It was an entire portrait of a human being. She died in her 8th month of pregnancy. Severe preeclampsia. Toxemia. They couldn't save them in time. Andrew stated this in a level voice. No drama, no theatrics, just the facts. But it was precisely that levelness that made Elena's throat tighten. 11 years, he said. Just work, portfolios, and an empty penthouse. I learned how to live in the silence, but I never learned to love it. Elena didn't say, "I'm so sorry." "I'm sorry" is something you say for yourself, to relieve your own discomfort when faced with someone else's agony. She simply reached her hand across the space between their beds and rested it on his forearm for a few seconds. Then she pulled it back. Andrew stared at his wrist, right where her hand had been. He didn't say a word, but something in him shifted, very subtly, almost invisibly, the way the light in a room changes when a cloud passes across the sun. That moment remained between them. Not as a promise, not as an explanation. It just lingered, like the smell of rain after the window is shut. On the 6th day, Dr. Sterling examined them both. He was a man of few words. He listened to her heart, checked the incision, reviewed the blood work, jotted something down. He told Elena she was healing beautifully. The IV, antibiotics, were done. She could be discharged. The restrictions: 2 weeks of zero physical strain, no lifting anything over 5 pounds, daily dressing changes, and follow-up in a month. He discharged Andrew on the same day. "Looks like our timelines matched up," Elena said when the surgeon left. "They did," Andrew agreed. "Did you drive here?" "No." A pause. "I need to drive you home," he stated. "You can't carry that duffel bag onto a public bus." Elena opened her mouth to argue that she could manage, but then she pictured the crowded city bus, the jarring stops, the overhead rails she'd have to cling to, and she closed her mouth. "Okay," she said. The next morning, they packed their bags simultaneously. Elena carefully folded her things into her small duffel. The apples were practically untouched, the themes prodigally untouched. Paperback remained unread. Andrew grabbed a black canvas weekender bag, also devoid of any luxury branding. At the door, she stopped and looked back at the room. 2 beds, 2 nightstands, a window framing the courtyard, and the bare rosehip bush. A thin, pristine layer of the season's first snow had fallen overnight. The red berries poked through, the white like tiny glowing embers. I woke up. I looked out that window. A promise kept. His car was idling in the hospital parking garage. A dark, heavy SUV. Expensive, but muted. Lacking the aggressive styling that screamed, "Look at my net worth." Just a remarkably well-engineered machine. Andrew opened the passenger door for her, waited until she was settled, and tossed her bag in the back. She didn't protest. Oakhaven was blanketed in snow. The first snow always makes a city look slightly unreal, as if someone took an eraser to all the grit and grime, leaving only clean outlines. The linden trees along Main Street were dusted white. The benches in front of the apartment buildings looked like soft, rounded mounds. Kids had already left zigzagging tracks on the sidewalks. Elena looked out the window and thought, "I'm alive. November, snow. I'm going home, home." That word sounded foreign now. What waited for her was a condo with a gaping hole where his leather recliner used to be, and an empty hook by the door where his coat always hung. She didn't know how it would hit her. She didn't know if she could walk through the door without something inside her shattering. Andrew drove in silence, refusing to shatter the peace. He asked for directions, only once, and she pointed the way. He parked at the curb in front of her. Building It was an older, pre-war brick building. Her condo was on the 3rd floor. She stared up at the 3 flights of stairs she would have to climb with. Her bag, knowing she wasn't supposed to lift anything, and her stomach dropped. "I've got the bag," Andrew said, grabbing it before she could even formulate an objection. They walked up. She unlocked the door. The apartment greeted them with dead silence and the distinct smell of emptiness. There is a very specific odor in a house when someone's belongings have been hastily removed. His recliner was, in fact, gone. The corner by the TV looked completely wrong. The coat rack in the entryway, his heavy winter parka, was missing. Only her wool coat hung there. The kitchen, the oversized mug he always kept on the bottom shelf, was gone. And the framed photo from a fishing trip 3 years ago back, when they still took trips together, had also left a rectangular ghost of dust on the shelf. The emptiness wasn't in the objects. It was in the habit. In 8 years of the wine, daily presence of a man who hadn't loved her the way he should have, but who had simply been there. Elena stood in the middle of the living room. She wasn't crying. She was just standing. Andrew dropped the bag, took one look around, walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and shut it. "I'm going to run to the grocery store," he said. "You don't need to. You can't lift anything over 5 pounds for 2 weeks." He looked at her calmly, not with the tone of a savior, but of someone citing clinical facts. "That is a medical directive, not an opinion." And he walked out the door before she could argue. Elena lowered herself carefully onto the sofa, her incision twinged with any sudden movement. She stared at the empty corner where his recliner used to sit. Andrew returned 40 minutes later, carrying 2 heavy paper grocery bags. Chicken, fresh vegetables, a few other staples. She didn't inspect them. He unpacked everything into the fridge and pantry with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. No rushing, no wasted movement. Then he set a 3-point, heavy pot on the stove. "You know how to make soup?" she asked. "I learned," he said. "When you live alone, you either learn to cook or you live off DoorDash." It was abundantly clear he did not live off DoorDash. The smell of chicken broth began to fill the apartment, slowly and fundamentally, the way dawn light fills a room after a long, dark night. A warm, living smell. Sitting on the sofa, looking through the open kitchen doorway at a man she barely knew stirring a pot on her stove, Elena suddenly realized a tear was rolling down her cheek. Not out of grief, not because of the text message, not for the 8 lost years or the empty corner, simply because someone had walked into her home and made her soup. She quickly wiped her cheek and turned toward the window, where the sky was bruising purple, and the first snow lay flat and pure, like a blank sheet of paper. She needed to figure out what was next. The divorce, the legal paperwork, the condo, going back to work, all of it loomed ahead. Massive, complicated, exhausting. But first, there was soup, and there was this man nearby who was in no rush and demanded absolutely nothing. And for some reason, that felt like the strangest, yet the most undeniably correct thing that had happened to her in weeks. He left that evening, mentioning he had booked a hotel, though he didn't specify which one. At the front door, he paused. "Will you be all right tomorrow?" "I'll be fine. I can manage. I'll come by in the morning," he said, not asking, informing her, the way one reports on a settled itinerary. "Elena," he said, using her name without the formality of a last name for the first time. Do you remember our deal? She looked at him. I remember, she said softly. He gave a sharp, single nod and walked out. She stood by the closed door for a moment, then leaned her back against it and stared into her dim entryway. Outside, the snow was still falling. Slow, genuine winter snow. 8 years, Elena thought, ended with a text message. And something new begins. With a nod in a hospital room and the smell of chicken soup in an empty apartment. Life was a bizarre thing. He arrived at 8:30 a.m. Elena had been awake since 7. Mornings were when the key day, incision burned the most, and she had lain there staring at the ceiling, listening to the neighborhood wake up. First, the super scraping a shovel against the pavement below, then the rumble of the city bus at the corner, then footsteps on the stairs outside her door. The doorbell rang early, and she went to open it, instinctively pressing a hand against her side. Dr. Sterling had said there was no need to brace it, but it made her feel more secure. Andrew stood on the welcome mat holding a paper bag of groceries and a cardboard tray with 2 coffees. You don't have an elevator, he observed. I believe this is the 3rd walk-up of my entire life. Judging by his tone, he wasn't complaining. He was just logging a statistical anomaly. Elena stepped aside. He walked straight into the kitchen, set down the groceries, placed 1 coffee cup in front of her at the table, and sat across from her with his own. How did you sleep? He asked. Poorly. Okay, I guess. It hurts more in the mornings. That will pass by the end of the week. Dr. Sterling warned us. Did you take notes during Dr. Sterling's debrief? I listen carefully when it's important. Elena looked at him. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window. Outside was a gray December morning. The courtyard below, the swing set buried in snow, looked entirely at ease, as if sitting at a stranger's kitchen table at 8:30 inches. The morning was the most normal thing in the world. You don't have to come here every single day, she said. I know. Then why do you? He turned to face her. Because you are medically restricted from lifting heavy objects, and groceries don't walk themselves up 3 flights of stairs. A brief pause. And because it is very quiet in this apartment right now, I know exactly what that sounds like. She didn't say anything, because it was true. The silence in the condo had a Tectovine, dense, heavy quality to it, as if the walls knew something had been violently extracted and hadn't quite decided how to resettle. He came over every morning. He didn't move in. That was a crucial distinction. He stayed at his hotel, which Elena had never seen. But judging by his pressed clothes and general demeanor, was undoubtedly a 5-star establishment, downtown. Andrew never brought it up, never complained about the commute or praised the room service. He simply arrived, spent most of the day at her place, and left in the evening. He brought food. He cooked simple meals, soups, chicken and rice, hard-boiled, eggs which he left in the fridge with post-it notes for the next day. The notes were brutally functional, like an industrial manual. 2 eggs, bread in the placen, bread box, 1 tomato left. Elena would laugh at these notes, silently, to herself, and then she would realize how long it had been since she had laughed at all. By the 4th day, she realized she was waiting for him, not with the fluttering heart and frantic anticipation of a teenager waiting for a crush. Just that, come morning, a quiet sector of her brain would start counting down the minutes until the doorbell rang. And when he walked in, something inside her lungs would finally exhale. That terrified her. She was still legally married. Her head was an absolute mess of post-op fatigue, an eerily empty condo, and a divorce that hadn't even officially been filed yet. She had neither the emotional bandwidth nor the right to analyze what this waiting meant. She forbade herself from thinking about it, forcing her mind toward work instead. If all went well, she'd be back in her classroom in 3 weeks. She wondered if Danny was still picking fights over the robotics versus paleontology debate. She realized she needed to text her colleague, Nancy, and ask her to drop off the grading folders since she couldn't carry the heavy tote bag herself. She texted Nancy that afternoon. Nancy came over the very next day, hauling a tote full of second-grade worksheets, a Tupperware of baked ziti, and such an ungodly amount of teachers' lounge gossip that Elena spent an hour laughing so hard she practically forgot her incision. Andrew happened to walk in with groceries just as Nancy was leaving. They crossed paths in the entryway. 10 minutes later, Nancy texted, "El. Who is that?" Elena texted back, "My hospital roommate." Nancy replied, "I see." And in that "I see," there was so much loaded implication that Elena locked her phone screen and pretended she had never read it. Greg called on the 5th day. Elena was sitting by the window with her paperback, the one she had packed for the hospital, and finally cracked open. His name flashed on the screen, and she stared at it for several seconds. For 8 years, that caller ID had meant husband. Now, it meant something else, a concept she didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. She answered, "Elena." His voice came through the speaker. He sounded like a man who had already assigned the roles for this conversation and expected her to play her part. "I need you to sign the quitclaim deed for the condo." "What deed?" she asked, keeping her voice flat. "A voluntary relinquishment of your equity. My lawyer has the paperwork ready. I can drop it off today." Elena looked out the window. The courtyard, the swings, the snow. "No," she said, a split-second pause. He hadn't expected that answer. Or maybe he had, but was banking on her caving. "Elle, don't make this complicated." His tone hardened. Not shouting, but that specific, condescending cadence she knew intimately. The "let me explain reality to you" tone. "I put down the down payment." "You put down the down payment," she agreed. "But we paid the mortgage 50/50 for 8 years. I have every bank statement to prove it." Silence on the line. "That won't change anything," he said. And then his voice shifted. A cold, nasty edge crept in. "I have a very good lawyer. And I have proof that following your surgery, you were in an altered state of mind and incapable of making sound, legal decisions." Elena sat very still. "What does that mean?" "It means," Greg said smoothly, "that if I have to, I will prove to a judge that you lacked mental capacity. For example, when you made certain decisions regarding, let's just say, entertaining other men while heavily medicated." A pause. "Think about it. You're only going to make it worse for yourself. Text me when you're ready to sign." The call ended. Elena lowered the phone to her lap and stared at the blank screen. Outside, it was dead quiet. The white courtyard, the frozen swings, lacked mental capacity. Entertaining other men. She ran the phrases through her head, slowly, like thumbing a deck of cards. And, suddenly, she understood exactly what he was doing. He was talking about Andrew, about her proposal in the hospital room, about whatever she had said out loud in front of the nurses, the orderlies, God knows who else. About the fact that mere days after major surgery, a strange man was showing up at her apartment every play single morning. From all of that, a lawyer could weave a narrative. A false one, but a highly persuasive one to the right judge. Andrew arrived 2 hours later. He saw instantly that something was wrong. She was sitting at the kitchen table staring at a cold cup of tea, her eyes fixed on the wall. He set the bags down and sat across from her. What happened? She told him everything, word for word, as she remembered it. Her voice was dead, level. This was a new development compared to that morning in the hospital room. Back then, she had sobbed. Now, she didn't. She simply reported the facts. Andrew listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back. "He doesn't just want the condo," Andrew finally said. "I know. No, you don't. Listen to me." He looked at her with absolute gravity. "Elena, I'm going to explain exactly what this tactic is. If a family court judge declares that you lacked mental capacity during your post-op period, it nullifies any agreements or decisions you make right now. It throws your entire legal standing into question. Your ability to fight for equitable distribution in the divorce, your right to your own assets." Elena stared at him. "How do you know how this works?" "Because I've been in corporate boardrooms and hostile takeovers for a very long time." He leaned forward slightly. "It's an old playbook. It's not particularly clever, but it works flawlessly if you don't crush it immediately. You need a lawyer. A shark. Lawyers cost money?" "Yes." A pause. Elena looked at him. He looked right back. "No," she said. "You don't even know what I'm going to offer." "I do. You're going to offer me your personal attorney for free, or you're going to pay his retainer, or you'll set up some shell company scheme. But you'll be footing the bill, and I can't accept that." "Why not?" "Because I don't know how I could ever repay you," she said tightly, "and I'm used to the fact that nothing is ever free." He sat in silence for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice low and immovably firm. "I am not Greg." 4 words. She exhaled a shaky breath. "I know," she said. "But 8 years teaches a person to be careful." "Fair enough." He nodded. He wasn't offended. He didn't argue. He just accepted it as a variable in the equation. "All right, then we do it this way. Paul Richards. He is the most ruthless family law attorney in the tri-state area. I will give you his number. You call him yourself. You negotiate his retainer. Yourself. I won't intervene. If you hit a wall and need a loan, you ask. Deal?" Elena looked at him. "Do you remember our deal?" She echoed his words. "I remember. You bring it up at every available opportunity because it's the truth." She stood up and walked to the window. The courtyard, the snow, the swings. 8 years she had spent being careful, being accommodating, and it had gotten her absolutely nowhere. 8 years of waiting for things to fix themselves. Maybe sometimes you just have to pick up the phone and call a shark. "Give me the number," she said finally. Paul Richards arrived at her condo 2 days later. A man in his late 50s, heavy-set, with slow, deliberate movements but incredibly fast eyes. Eyes that didn't match the rest of him. They took in an entire room, in a fraction of a second, and immediately classified everything in it. He walked in with a battered leather briefcase, sat at the kitchen table, accepted a cup of black coffee and said, "Walk me through it." Elena walked him through it. He listened without taking a single note, only occasionally interrupting to ask, "Date? Dollar amount? Whose name is on the title?" When she finished, he popped the latches on his briefcase, pulled out a legal pad, and laid it flat. Right. Let's look at the board, he said. His voice was that of a man who delivered these exact monologues daily, and the only reason he wasn't bored to tears was because he genuinely loved winning. Regarding the property division, your position is ironclad. If the monthly mortgage payments were routed through your personal checking account, or even a joint account, where your deposits matched the withdrawal, you said you have the bank statements for all 8 years? He raised a single eyebrow, a brown privilege time, millimeter shift. Apparently, clients who actually kept 8 years of financial records were a rarity. Excellent. Secondly, regarding this threat of an incompetency motion, it's a garbage legal strategy on his part, but we cannot ignore it. We need an affidavit from your surgeon, Dr. Sterling, confirming the procedure was routine and your recovery was standard. Furthermore, we need pharmaceutical records confirming that the post-op meds you were prescribed do not fall into any narcotic classification that legally impairs judgment. It's a standard block. I'm assuming it was standard NSAIDs and antibiotics. Nothing opioid-based, just Tylenol codeine for 2 days, then standard ibuprofen, Elena said. Perfect. But we need it on paper. He paused. And I need you to be utterly merciless in court. I am, Elena said. Paul Richards looked over his reading glasses at her, and he gave a slow, approving nod. The kind of nod a man gives when he hears exactly what he hoped to hear, but is still pleased by it. Good, he said. Then we go to war. Andrew had been sitting against the far wall in the living room the entire time. He was so still he practically blended into the plaster. Paul hadn't addressed him once, and Andrew hadn't chimed in. When the lawyer packed his briefcase and said his goodbyes, Elena walked him to the door, then returned to the kitchen. You paid his retainer up front, she stated. It wasn't a question. Paul, Richards doesn't do house calls. Paul is an old fraternity brother, Andrew replied, not missing a beat. He accepts clients at his downtown firm. I asked him to drive out here because your doctor explicitly forbade you from climbing 3 flights of stairs. That was entirely Andrew. Elena stared at him. He looked back, patient, unblinking. The look of a man who holds all the cards and knows it. You're incredibly methodical, she said. Every single day. The coffee, the groceries, the soup, the shark attorney doing house calls. It's all very precise and very stealthy. Do you object? A pause. No, she said softly. I'm just not used to it. I know. He stood up and grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. Get used to it. 3 days later, Greg called again. This time, Elena was ready. She answered the phone and let him speak. He immediately launched into his spiel about the condo, the quitclaim deed, his lawyer. This time, his voice carried a smug confidence, as if someone had recently puffed up his ego. Greg, she cut him off mid-sentence. I have retained legal counsel. From this second forward, all communications go through him. She gave him Paul Richards' name and firm. The silence on the other end of the line was of a completely different molecular procid-plossin structure than the last time. If before he had been silent out of surprise, now he was silent out of raw recognition. Anybody in local real estate or sales knew that law firm. Ellie. He started, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, slipping into a cautious backpedal. Through my attorney, she repeated, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a full minute. Then she got up and turned. On the kettle. Outside it was December. A gray, oppressive, Midwestern December, with early sunsets and a miserable, gritty snow that lacked the magic of the first freeze. It was just gray and inevitable. Elena watched the snow swirl under the street lamp and thought, "That's it. The talking is over. Now comes the litigation, the affidavits, the depositions." But it's not terrifying anymore. It's just admin. That feeling, the absence of terror, replaced by clinical logistics, was entirely new. She examined the feeling in her mind. No, she wasn't scared. She felt anger. A pure, cold, administrative anger, completely devoid of tears. She felt exhaustion. And she felt a bedrock of sheer resolve. It was a good feeling. That evening, as Andrew was putting on his coat to leave for his hotel, Elena spoke up. "Andrew." "Wait." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. "Were you serious about what you offered in the hospital?" she asked, choosing her words deliberately. "I don't mean the chicken soup or the lawyer. I mean what you said right before. They rolled me into the ore." "Yes," he said. "We've known each other for less than a month." "I know. You only know what I told you in a hospital ward and whatever background check your buddy Paul could run in 5 minutes." "He ran less than you think," Andrew said, evenly. "I explicitly told him not to dig." Elena stared at him. "People call this a rebound, a fling. You know I don't. Strike you as a man who does flings." "You don't," she conceded. "Which is why, if I commit to one, I make sure it's permanent." She went quiet. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the glass. The lone street lamp in the courtyard swayed violently. "Give me time," she finally said. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know." "That's fine," he said. "I'll wait." He said it so naturally, without any grand theatrical vows, just stating a structural fact of the universe. And she believed him instantly, without a shadow of a doubt. He wasn't waiting because he had nothing better to do. He was waiting because he had made an executive decision to wait. And when a man like him made a decision, it manifested as reality, not mere intention. He left. She stood by the door for a moment, then walked back into the kitchen, flipped on the overhead light, and started washing her tea mug. Slowly, methodically, with the radio playing softly in the background. She thought, everything is a leap of faith. You can spend your whole life waiting for the perfect moment, the flawless alignment of circumstances, absolute guarantee of safety. And you will die waiting. Because the perfect moment doesn't arrive on its own. You have to manufacture it. For 8 years, she hadn't chosen anything. She had just drifted on the Bacchus current, letting it drag her wherever it wanted, and she had mistaken her apathy for patience. No more. The next morning, he arrived with coffee as usual. She met him at the door. "I need to see a notary public," she said. "Paul explained that I need to legally swear out an affidavit proving the mortgage was drafted from my account. Will you come with me?" "Yes. And one more thing." She looked up at him. "You suggested I move into your place during the divorce proceedings, so I wouldn't be isolated here. I thought about it. I agree." Andrew didn't reply immediately. He simply looked at her for several seconds, and on his face appeared an expression that people get when they are suddenly handed the one thing they had almost given up hoping for. Not triumph, but a profound, quiet relief. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." Paul Richards' law firm was located in a sleek downtown high-rise, smelling of polished mahogany and the expensive scent of billable hours. The notary, a woman in her 50s wearing sharp reading glasses, possessing the aura of someone who witnessed the documentary collapse of human lives on a daily basis, methodically reviewed Elena's banking records. "You have the wire transfers?" she asked. "For all 8 years?" She reacted, exactly like Paul had. A slight arch of the eyebrow. "Your soon-to-be ex-husband has already filed his response to the Division of Assets," the notary noted, glancing at a file. "His counsel is demanding a place, 50-50 split of the equity." She took off her glasses, wiped them with a microfiber cloth, and put them back on. "Your paper trail is bulletproof. Assuming everything in these ledgers passes discovery, the judge will likely rule in your favor, but brace yourself. Your ex knows this. He may try to escalate." "I'm ready," Elena said. The notary peered at her over the rims of her glasses. A brief, highly calibrated assessment. "I can see that," she murmured. Andrew sat in a leather wingback chair in the corner of the office, scrolling through his phone. He didn't intervene. He didn't offer unsolicited advice. He didn't double-check her paperwork. He was simply there, like a load-bearing wall. You don't actively stare at it, but you know the roof won't cave in because of it. When they walked out onto the street, the snow had stopped. The sky was the color of dirty chalk. A low, oppressive Ohio December sky. "Are you hungry?" Andrew asked. "Yes." "Let's go." They ducked into a small diner a block away. A no-frills joint with scuffed laminate tables and vinyl booths that squeaked every time you shifted your weight. They ordered black coffee and slices of cherry pie. Andrew stared out the window. Elena looked at him. "You're incredibly calm," she observed. "I try to be." "No, seriously. Do you ever actually get nervous?" "I get nervous." He turned his attention back to her. "I just don't broadcast it." "Are you nervous right now?" "A pause." "Mildly," he admitted. "Because you just agreed to move into my house, and I am currently calculating whether I even remember how to cohabitate in a shared space. 11 years is a hell of a habit to break." Elena looked down at her coffee mug. "You just told me the truth." "I try to tell the truth when it's productive. When it's counterproductive, I just keep my mouth shut." She nodded, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. "Well, here's my truth," she said. "I have no idea how any of this is going to end. My divorce isn't finalized. I have a brutal court battle ahead of me, and I'm barely 6 weeks out of major surgery. I am currently surviving on your Starbucks runs and your Post-it notes about eggs. Statistically speaking, this is absolute insanity. Statistically, yes." He agreed, staring at his pie. "But when I'm next to you, I'm not scared," she said, "which is completely irrational, because I should be terrified. But I'm not." Andrew didn't say a word. He just looked at her, deeply, silently. Then he reached across the table and pushed the small metal creamer pitcher an inch closer to her coffee cup. That was his answer. She accepted it. Outside the diner window, Oakhaven was dragging itself through its final December days. Gray, freezing, with naked linden trees and a dusting of snow that had nowhere to be in a hurry. A city Elena knew by heart, every pothole, every alleyway. And in this city, in this diner with the squeaky vinyl booth, something was beginning to shift. Slowly. Not on the exterior, but deep in the place. Bedrock. It would take time, but for the first time in years, she had time. Andrew's house was in a historic district downtown. A stunning, three-story, the brownstone that had survived the urban decay of the 70s. And the 70s, gentrification of the 90s. It boasted a brand new slate roof but retained its original, foot-thick brick walls, 12-foot ceilings, original hardwood, floors that groaned slightly underfoot, and towering windows that looked out over the avenue. It was furnished with severe minimalism, not the flashy catalog kind, but highly functional. The kind of home organized by a man who needed a staging ground for his work, rather than a showroom for his ego. Books lined the walls, in exact, flush rows. None of that engineered casual clutter meant to signal intellect. These were heavily read hardcovers and paperbacks, some bristling with post-it flags, others worn down at the spine from multiple readings. Elena ran her finger along the spines while he gave her the tour. Urban, planning, macroeconomic theory, historical biographies, a few novels Steinbeck, Hemingway, some translated Russian literature. On one isolated shelf sat 3 oversized volumes on modernist architecture and one remarkably thin, hand-bound book with no title on the spine. "What's this?" she asked. "Vera's charcoal sketches," he said curtly. "I had them bound." Elena immediately pulled her hand away from the shelf. There were 2 bedrooms. This detail was also critical. His master suite and a guest room where the bed was freshly made with high thread count linens, and the massive walk-in closet had been completely emptied out for her in advance. The kitchen boasted an espresso machine that looked like it belonged in an Italian cafe, but there was zero clutter. No decorative fruit bowls, no fake succulents. Those little touches that turn a structure into a home were entirely absent. It was a machine for living. The man knew how to architect a corporate empire, but he had forgotten how to architect a life. Elena unpacked her duffel bag into the cavernous closet. She stacked her few paperbacks on the nightstand. Then she walked out to the kitchen and noticed a wide, sun-drenched windowsill even in the bleak December light. It caught the sun perfectly. It was completely empty, just blank marble. "Can I?" she started. He turned from the espresso machine. "Can I bring my geranium over?" "From the condo. I bought it years ago. It's practically indestructible." Andrew looked at the empty marble sill, then at her. Of course, the pot arrived the next day. Nancy from school had offered to swing by Elena's old place and grab the terracotta pot, which boasted one stubborn blooming red flower and a few tight buds. Elena placed it on the marble sill, nudging it an inch to the left to catch the optimal angle of the winter sun, and then retreated to her room. Andrew was in his home office, on a conference call. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen island drinking tea, she caught his gaze lingering on the terracotta pot. He stared at it for a full 5 seconds longer than a person casually registers an inanimate object. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it, and in that gaze, there was something devastatingly quiet. She decided not to ask. Their cohabitation was built on the minor collisions of their deeply entrenched habits. Andrew possessed a rigid routine. He woke at 6:30 a.m., made coffee, and locked himself in his office for exactly 1 hour of deep work before emerging for breakfast. Elena didn't know this at first. One morning at 7:15, she knocked lightly on the office door to ask where he kept the coffee filters. The door swung open. He looked at her with the blank, slightly feral expression of a deep-sea diver suddenly yanked to the surface. Not angry, just fundamentally disconnected, as if he were operating in a different time zone. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back. "It's fine." He blinked, rubbing his temples. "I just don't pivot tasks very quickly. You could have warned me." "I could have. I'm just not used to explaining my operational hours to anyone because there's been no one to explain them to." "A beat? Well, you could have," she repeated softly. From that morning on, she carved out her own quiet hour. While he worked behind the closed door, she sat by the kitchen window with her coffee. The geranium on the sill, the bustling avenue below, the bundled-up pedestrians hurrying to the Brisauven subway. At 7:30 sharp, his office door would open and they would eat breakfast together. It became an unspoken ritual. It organically clicked into place, and neither of them tried to alter it. Elena, conversely, had a habit of thinking out loud, very quietly, but when her B-blink brain was untangling a problem, her vocal cords automatically engaged. "I wonder why the school board mandated that new phonics curriculum." No, that rubric makes no sense. Have to restructure the grading." "Huh, that's a fascinating approach." At first, Andrew assumed she was talking to him. One evening over dinner, he stopped chewing and asked, "Are you addressing me?" "No one," she clarified, slightly embarrassed. "I just process things out loud." "Is it annoying?" He considered this. "No. I'll adapt." And he adapted much faster than she anticipated. He started responding. Short, razor-sharp observations. Sometimes playing devil's advocate, asking a pointed question that instantly derailed her train of thought and forced her to look at a lesson plan from a completely different angle. It turned out, it was an intoxicating feeling having someone nearby who didn't just passively hear the audio frequencies of your voice, but actually thought alongside you. Greg had never thought alongside her. He had either thought for her or thought about himself. Paul Richards called during the third week of December. His voice was smooth as ever. He was a man built of polished mahogany and exact legal statutes. But beneath the polish, Elena detected the faint hum of a warning siren. "Elena, I need you to come down to the firm today. If possible." A new variable has entered the equation. They took an Uber downtown. Paul was waiting in the main conference room. Andrew sat next to her at the massive glass table. He didn't sit against the wall this time. Paul opened a manila folder and slid 2 stapled documents across the glass. "Your soon-to-be ex-husband and a Miss Chrissy Weaver have filed a joint sworn affidavit," Paul said. "They are formally petitioning the court to declare you temporarily incapacitated during your post-operative window. The grounds they are citing state you were under the influence of heavy narcotics that severely impaired your cognitive function and decision-making capabilities." Elena stared at the crisp legal font. "Chrissy," she said. "Miss Weaver, the nurse from the hospital." "Correct. A licensed medical professional," Paul noted grimly. "This elevates their leverage. A judge will weigh the sworn testimony of an RN regarding a patient's lucidity heavily. Much heavier than the testimony of a layman." Paul took off his glasses, polished them, and put them back on. "They also note, and I quote, your erratic and highly abnormal behavior, including but not limited to rushing into an intimate relationship and expressing intent to marry a virtual stranger mere days after a major surgical trauma, as empirical evidence of your manic state." Silence in the conference room. "They're using us against me," Elena said. "Yes." Andrew stared at the documents. His face was a mask of stone, but the muscle in His jaw was flexing rhythmically, a tell Elena had learned to read. "What's our counterplay?" Andrew asked. "We need 3 pillars," Paul said, ticking them off on his fingers. 1. Anne. Affidavit from the chief surgeon, Dr. Sterling, detailing her flawless recovery. I already have that. 2. A pharmacological breakdown from a toxicologist, proving the prescribed dosages of painkillers do not trigger manic episodes or cognitive impairment. I have that too. He paused. The structural weakness is Miss Weaver. If an RN takes the stand and swears, under oath, that Elena was hallucinating or exhibiting manic behavior in the recovery ward, a conservative judge might buy it. We need to either nuke her, credibility entirely, or produce a witness with superior medical credentials to testify to the exact opposite. Nurse Valerie Higgins, Elena said instantly. Paul looked up from his notes. You've spoken to her? She was the charge nurse on my floor. Old school, meticulous. In 30 years, she's probably never had a single write-up. She checked my vitals every 4 hours. If she agrees to submit an affidavit, the optics completely flip. 2 nurses offering contradictory sworn statements. A. Judge will look at their respective tenure and disciplinary records. Nurse Higgins' record is flawless. Andrew interjected quietly. I'll call her, Elena said. They showed up at the brownstone the very next afternoon without calling ahead. Elena was at the kitchen island, scrolling through an article on her iPad. When the intercom buzzed, she hit the talk button. Who is it? And she heard Greg's voice. Smooth, artificially reasonable. Elle, buzz us up. We need to talk this out like civilized adults. She stared at the intercom panel. Andrew stepped out of his office and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. She pressed the unlock button. Greg wasn't alone. Chrissy was a half step behind him, her arm looped, conspicuously, through his. She wore an expression that aggressively telegraphed, look at us. We're a united front, and we hold the high ground. Greg had changed over the last month. Not physically, but something in his posture had warped. He stood too straight. His eye contact was too intense. It was the desperate overcompensation of a man losing his grip on a situation. Nice place, he said, surveying the 12-foot ceilings and the modern art. Out of your bracket, though. What's your angle here, Elle? She crossed her arms. What do you want, Greg? He turned to her and smiled. Broadly, almost warmly. And that warmth was the Brad Baiwan, most repulsive thing she had seen in years, because she knew down to her marrow how fake it was. Elle, you're a smart girl. He used his patronizing, let's be reasonable voice. Just sign the quitclaim deed on the condo, and we kill all this noise. No nasty court battles, no dragging your medical history into the public record. We wipe the slate clean and go our separate ways. And you'll withdraw the incompetency petition? Of course. Why would we push it if we can just settle this amicably? Chrissy stood slightly off to the side, refusing to make eye contact with Elena, staring instead at the espresso machine. She had the distinct look of someone executing a play they were no longer 100% confident in. Elena looked back and forth between them. It was strange. She fully expected her chest to tighten. She expected a surge of rage, or pain, or at least the visceral humiliation of having him stand in this beautiful kitchen, flashing his fake smile. She felt absolutely nothing. Nothing but a bone-deep exhaustion, the kind you feel when a brutal, miles-long hike is finally over. Get out, she said. Greg's smile didn't vanish, but it froze in place like cheap plastic. Elle, she looked him dead in the eye. From this second forward, you speak only to Paul Richards. Do you even understand who you are picking a fight with? Get out. Chrissy tugged urgently on his sleeve. He lingered for another 2 seconds, purely out of momentum, because being summarily dismissed wasn't in his script. Then he spun around and marched out the door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. Elena stood in the foyer. She slowly exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, walked back into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of ice water, and drained it. Andrew hadn't said a word the entire time. He simply walked over to the kettle, turned it on, and silently placed a mug of freshly steeped chamomile tea in front of her. That night, they sat in the dim light of the kitchen island. Andrew explained it quietly, surgically, the way a man dissects a hostile corporate merger. Do you understand what their actual end game is? It's not just the real estate, equity. I thought about that, she said. If a judge signs an order declaring you temporarily incapacitated, every single legal and financial move you make is retroactively poisoned. Your leverage in the divorce settlement, your right to your own bank accounts. He paused. And one more thing. Our marriage license. If we file for it, it will be contested as fraudulent. Elena stared at him. But we haven't even gone to City Hall yet. He looked at her with unwavering intensity. They are trying to permanently bolt the door shut before you can even walk through it. They want to strip you of your legal agency. And if we go to the courthouse right now and pull a marriage license, Greg's attorney will hold it up to a judge and say, "Look, this billionaire manipulated a heavily medicated, traumatized woman into a sham marriage." Paul knows this, Andrew added. And so do I. Then what is the point? Andrew remained silent. The refrigerator hummed softly. The point is not for the judge, he said finally. The point is for us. Elena looked at him. Or, are you still unsure? He asked. Not as a challenge, but as a completely sincere question. She thought about it. Truly, deeply thought about it. Not with panic, not with momentum. She thought about everything that had happened since that snowy November morning in the hospital room, about the nod that she had thought was a polite deflection, about the sterile post-it notes detailing his grocery runs, about the terracotta geranium on the windowsill, which he stared at when I thought she wasn't looking, about how he actually listened to her talk about second graders, about grabbing his forearm in the dark, and how he had stared at his own wrist afterward. I'm sure, she said quietly. She didn't sleep that night. It had become a habit, not a tortured, panic-inducing insomnia like before, but just a waking state. Her brain simply refused to power down, and she had learned it was better to just lie there, write it out, rather than fight it. She thought about how, in just 3 weeks, the geography of this massive brownstone had become familiar. She knew which floorboard in the hallway groaned. She knew how to prime his ridiculously complicated espresso machine without having to ask. She realized his silences were no longer alien territory. They had become a shared space, a silence that didn't require frantic chatter to make it bearable. The wall between their bedrooms was thick. She couldn't hear if he was asleep or awake. She got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. He was there, sitting at the island in the dark, nursing a mug, staring out the dark window. Outside was a snowless, bitter Ohio December. A street lamp on the corner flickered in the wind, casting a swaying pendulum of yellow light across the prostrate marble countertops. Andrew looked up. He wasn't surprised to see her. Elena sat on the stool opposite him. They sat in silence for a very long time. The kind of silence shared by people who don't need to generate words to justify being in the same room. Andrew? Yes. In all this time, you've never once tried to hold my hand or kiss me. Not since that one night in the hospital ward. She spoke slowly, carefully navigating the words. He looked at her. I didn't want to crowd you, he said. And what if I said I want you to hold my hand? Silence. The street lamp swayed outside. A beam of yellow light dragged briefly across his face, then plunged him back into the shadows. Slowly, deliberately, Andrew reached his hand across the marble island, palm facing up. Elena laid her hand over his. They sat like that for an eternity. She didn't check the clock, but it was a long time. The electric kettle on the counter went completely cold. The street lamp swayed. December marched relentlessly forward. It wasn't a passionate kiss. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood declaration of undying love. It was none of the things society categorizes as the moment. It was just two hands gripping each other across a cold marble counter at 3.0 inches. The morning, and yet, it held infinitely more gravity than anything she had experienced in 8 years, with the man whose last name she legally shared. Eventually, she pulled her hand back and stood up. Good night, she said. Good night, he replied. She went back to her room and, for the first time in months, fell asleep. Moment, her head hit the pillow. At breakfast the next morning, Andrew looked up from his coffee. When? She knew exactly what he meant. No context needed. I need to check the calendar. Paul said we shouldn't delay. But we shouldn't look like we're rushing in a panic either. Paul is right from a litigation standpoint, Andrew said, taking a sip. But I'm not asking Paul. I'm asking you. Are you ready? Yes, she said. He set his mug down with a soft clink. Then let's go today. The county clerk's office was located 3 blocks away, housed in a formidable, neoclassical building with heavy limestone columns. Inside, it smelled of floor, wax, and the faint, dusty scent of municipal bureaucracy. The smell of places where critical documents go to sleep in filing cabinets forever. The clerk behind the glass, a young woman with a tight bun and the exhausted stare of someone who listens to declarations of eternal devotion 8 times a shift and is thoroughly immune to it, took their IDs and typed them into the great system. There's a mandatory waiting period in Ohio, she droned. I can schedule your ceremony for next month, January 26th. 11 a.m. Perfect, Andrew said. Congratulations, the clerk recited mechanically, devoid of any malice. They walked back out onto the street. December slapped them with freezing wind, pushing a fine, stinging sleet. Ugly, unromantic, miserable Midwestern sleet. Elena flipped up the collar of her wool coat. Andrew stood beside her, unfazed. Near the courthouse steps, an old vendor had set up a heated metal cart. She was bundled in a massive parka, selling hot roasted peanuts in little brown paper bags. Andrew stopped, pulled out his wallet, bought 2 bags, and handed one to Elena. They stood on the freezing sidewalk, eating hot peanuts. It's exactly how people eat street food in the dead of an Ohio winter, shivering, stomping their boots, simply existing in the cold. We just booked a date at City Hall, Elena pointed out. We did. While I am, actively, the subject of a lawsuit contesting my basic mental competency. Yes, it's highly absurd. A little bit. She looked at him. At his stoic, serious face, holding a greasy brown paper bag of peanuts, squinting against the sleet. And suddenly, she found it hilarious. Not a polite chuckle, a real deep belly laugh that caught her completely off guard. The laughter burst out of her lungs and refused to stop. It was the sheer absurdity of the situation. The peanuts, the freezing sleet, the optics of how this would play to a jury. Two functioning adults standing on an icy sidewalk, having just booked a wedding date right in the crosshairs of a psychological two-fade team second competency hearing. Andrew watched her. And in the corners of his eyes, something shifted. Are you laughing at me? No. Something much warmer. What? She gasped, finally catching her breath. Nothing, he said softly. I just haven't heard it in a very long time. Heard what? Your laugh. Elena stared at him. Then she looked out at the street, at the gray, freezing city, at the stripped linden trees, at the peanut vendor, who was aggressively ignoring them to serve another customer. January 26th, at 11 a.m. Until then, there were roasted peanuts. And there was this man standing next to her in the freezing wind, who had just said, I haven't heard your laugh in a very long time, as if he had been waiting in the dark for it to arrive. It was bizarre. It was excellent. It was real. Paul Richards called her cell that afternoon. I spoke with Nurse Higgins, he said. His voice carried a very specific cadence, the cadence of a trial lawyer who just watched the opposing counsel step on a landmine. She is willing to sign a sworn affidavit. In fact, she informed me she has something else we need to see. She refused to transmit it. Electronically, can you meet her tomorrow? Elena hung up the phone and walked out into the hallway. Andrew was leaning against the doorframe of his office. He had heard. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he echoed. It's going to be fine. Elena looked at him. Are you saying that because you actually believe the data, or because you want me to stop stressing? Both. He answered with absolute sincerity. She nodded and headed toward her room. At the door, she paused and looked back. Andrew? Yes, that thin book on your shelf, with no title on the spine, Vera's sketches. He looked at her, his posture going perfectly rigid. Don't pack it away, Elena said quietly. Leave it exactly where it is. A long, heavy pause hung in the hallway. Okay, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She closed her door. Outside, December was grinding through its final days. Bitter, dark, and honest. Next week was New Year's. In a month, a wedding. Ahead lay a brutal court, battle, reams of legal discovery, and a gauntlet she had to run. But today was, this day, peanuts on a freezing sidewalk, a laugh, a hand resting over a hand. At 3:00 the morning. Sometimes, Elena thought, life does exactly what it is supposed to do. Just rarely on the timeline you expected. January in the Midwest carries a very specific type of silence. It's not the damp quiet of autumn or the dead heat of summer. Winter silence is dense, like fiberglass insulation, and simultaneously brittle, like spun glass. A thick blanket of snow had buried Oakhaven, silencing the traffic. The streets were deserted in the mornings, and the entire city seemed to be holding its breath after the holidays, bracing for the rest of the year. For Elena, the rest of the year was a mountain. Paul Richards was methodically building a fortress around her. They met twice a week, and every time he brought new briefs, new motions, new contingencies, Dr. Sterling's affidavit was locked in. Surgery. Routine. Complications. 0. Recovery. Nominal. The hospital pharmacist had furnished an expert statement regarding the postoperative medications, standard anti-inflammatories, and a Planomulse, brief course of codeine. Nothing a judge would legally define as a mind-altering narcotic capable of voiding a contract. The clerks at the county office who issued the marriage license submitted statements confirming Elena appeared, composed, lucid, and acting under her own free will. The perimeter is secure, Paul told them, tapping a pen against his legal pad. But the core vulnerability remains. Miss Chrissy Weaver. She is a licensed RN. If she takes the stand and perjures herself, claiming she witnessed acute delirium or narcotic psychosis in the recovery room, it becomes a coin toss with the judge, Nurse Valerie Higgins. Elena reminded him. I spoke with her. She is willing to testify, Paul said carefully. But I need to know exactly what she's bringing to the table before I put her on a witness stand. Nurse Valerie Higgins showed up at the brownstone the next day, entirely unannounced. She buzzed the intercom at 10 in the morning and said she needed to see Elena. Elena suggested they meet down the street at the diner with the squeaky booths. Andrew stayed back at the house. Valerie arrived straight from a night shift, wearing a heavy wool coat with a prom, faux fur collar, and carrying a worn leather crossbody bag. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were entirely lucid. She ordered hot tea with lemon, placed her bag on her lap, and sat in silence for a moment, as if mentally weighing her opening statement. Ellie, she finally said, I need to show you something. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an iPhone, an older model with a spiderweb crack across the screen protector. She navigated to her voice memos app and pushed the phone across the laminate table. This was a complete accident. I didn't even realize it was recording at first. I sometimes use the voice memo app on my commute to dictate grocery lists. Remind myself of shift swaps. That day in early December, I was walking onto the gray floor and forgot to hit stop. I dropped the phone into my scrub pocket. Valerie looked at her with dead serious eyes. I was in the supply closet in the hallway. They didn't know I was on the other side of the door. Elena hit play. The audio file was roughly 8 minutes long. The first 2 minutes were just the ambient friction of a hospital ward. Distant alarms, squeaking rubber soles, muffled pages over the intercom. Then, much closer, 2 voices. Elena recognized them instantly. The blood drained from her face. Greg's voice. Hushed, but perfectly decipherable. Are you sure? The judge is... I'm going to swallow this? Chrissy's voice replied quickly, carrying the aggressive confidence of someone trying to convince themselves of their own lie. I'm a licensed floor nurse. I'll swear on the stand that she was delirious from the anesthesia, that she didn't recognize faces, that she was in a state of hyper-arousal. Who's going to audit that? It's my clinical assessment against a layman's. And the fact that she went and booked a wedding at City Hall a month later? Exactly. Chrissy's voice took on a triumphant edge. That's the smoking gun. Sane people do not do that. Nobody marries a random guy a month after major abdominal surgery. The judge will look at that timeline and rule she was out of her mind. A brief silence on the recording. Then Greg spoke again. The condo is the primary target. We force the sale, we split the liquid cash, 50-50, and we walk away clean. Chrissy mumbled something in agreement, but the audio clipped. Valerie must have shifted in the closet, because the fabric of her scrubs rustled loudly against the microphone. Then, just the ambient noise of the hallway again. Elena set the phone down. Her hands weren't shaking. She didn't feel a spike of rage or a physical ache. She felt only a terrifying, sub-zero clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when a paranoid suspicion crystallizes into absolute, undeniable fact. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had premeditated it. Chrissy was preparing to walk into a court of law, put her hand on a Bible, and commit felony perjury, banking entirely on her nursing license to shield her. "Do you understand the gravity of this recording?" Valerie asked quietly. "I do." I agonized over this. I didn't know if I was violating a wiretap law or hospital policy, Valerie said, gripping her tea mug. But I refused to sit by and watch a woman be stripped of her legal competency based on a fabricated clinical assessment. My oath is to protect patients. I will testify to the authenticity of this recording in front of a judge. Elena looked at her. "Valerie, thank you." The older nurse gave a sharp single nod. She didn't wave off the gratitude. She simply acknowledged it as a settled debt. Paul Richards listened to the recording that same afternoon. He sat at the kitchen island in the brownstone, wearing noise-canceling AirPods, his face a perfectly blank canvas. When the audio finished, he pulled the AirPods out, placed them in their case, and stared at the marble counter for 10 solid seconds. "Well then," Paul said. His voice had dropped half an octave, the voice a predator makes when it realizes the prey has accidentally locked itself in the prey cage. "This is no longer a civil dispute over marital assets," Paul said, folding his hands. "This is an audio recording of two individuals actively conspiring to commit perjury in a court of law for the explicit purpose of defrauding you of real property." Elena looked at him. "This is a criminal conspiracy," Paul continued smoothly. "Conspiracy to commit fraud in the first degree, given the valuation of the condo, coupled with intent to commit perjury. This carries mandatory prison time." Paul clicked his ballpoint pen and scribbled a single line on his legal pad. "We bypass the family court judge entirely. We are taking this straight to the Brassagi's district attorney's office. This recording is evidence for a grand jury. Is it legally admissible?" Andrew asked from the doorway. "Ohio is a one-party consent state." But Valerie wasn't a party to the conversation. "It falls under the Plainview exception for audio," Paul countered, effortlessly. "It was recorded inadvertently in a public hospital hallway where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. An unbroken chain of custody. It is entirely admissible." He looked up at Elena. "Are you prepared for the blowback? Criminal indictments? Move slowly. It will get ugly." "I'm ready," Elena said. Andrew, who had been completely silent, finally spoke. "When do we meet with the Ada?" "Tomorrow morning," Paul said. "I'll draft the criminal referral tonight." The assistant district attorney was a man in his early 30s, wearing a slightly wrinkled suit, projecting the aura of a man who worshipped procedure above all else. He received them in a cramped municipal office with a foggy, plastic window and a framed degree on the wall. He listened to Paul Richards' summary, accepted the flash drive containing the audio file, and played it on his desktop speakers. Twice. "Can we positively ID the voices?" the ADA asked. "My client, Miss Carter, can positively identify both individuals on the record," Paul stated. "Furthermore, if defense counsel challenges it, we welcome a forensic acoustic analysis." The ADA nodded, jotting something down on a yellow legal pad. "I'm opening a file. We'll issue subpoenas to bring both Mr. Vance and Miss Weaver in for questioning." He looked up at Elena. "Are you prepared to testify before a grand Jure? I am, she said. They walked out of the municipal building. The January air, sharply contrasting, the stifling, radiator-heated office, hit Elena's lungs like ice water. She took a deep breath and thought, "It's out of my hands now. It belongs to the machine. The system will grind them down at its own pace." Chrissy Weaver broke during her third interview with police detectives. Paul relayed the news to Elena over the phone with the casual detachment of a man reporting the weather. Initially, she stonewalled, Paul said. Claimed the audio was taken out of context. Claimed they were role-playing a hypothetical scenario to prepare for the civil trial. By the third interview, when the detectives informed her they had secured a warrant for her cell phone location data and text messages, she folded, she cried. Claimed Greg manipulated her. That it was a stupid joke. That she never actually intended to perjure herself. Greg held out longer. He aggressively denied the conspiracy, adopting the same rigid, arrogant posture Elena had witnessed in Andrew's foyer. He refused to discuss the condo or any financial agreements with Chrissy. He held the line until the DA authorized a voice print analysis, which matched his vocal biometrics with a 99% probability. At that point, he invoked his right to remain silent, but for a completely different reason. What happens to the incompetency motion? Elena asked automatically. Dead in the water, Paul said. Withdrawing it was a condition of Chrissy's cooperation agreement with the DA. Greg is facing felony indictment. The family, court judge threw the motion in the trash. Elena exhaled. The final property division hearing was scheduled for late January. It was held in a standard county courtroom, scuffed wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, high windows letting in a bleak winter glare. Greg sat at the opposing table with a new attorney, a young, visibly stressed public defender type who clearly hadn't had enough time to review the chaotic file he'd inherited. Was frantically flipping through documents with the manic energy of a man who knew the ship was taking on water. Paul Richards methodically arranged his files on the plaintiff's table. No rushing. No wasted movement. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with a short, severe haircut and the exhausted eyes of someone who had seen every conceivable variation of human greed, adjusted her microphone and reviewed the dockets. Paul presented his arguments with surgical precision. The bank records proving 50-50 mortgage payments for the first 6 years and 100% payments by Elena for the final 2. Her W-2S from the school district verifying a decade of continuous employment. A sworn affidavit from Mr. Henderson, a retired 7-2-year-old neighbor who had lived in their building for 20 years, stating clearly, Elena worked every day. Greg went months without leaving the C's apartment for a job. Greg's young attorney attempted to mount a defense regarding the initial down payment, arguing that Greg's upfront capital entitled him to a majority stake in the equity. Paul didn't even raise his voice. He simply slid a pie chart across the table. Your Honor, the initial down payment constituted exactly 18% of the property's purchase price. The remaining 82% was financed via a mortgage that my client serviced entirely for the last 24 months. The judge listened, scribbled notes, and then ordered a 40-minute recess to brace and review the ledgers. Elena sat on a wooden bench out in the hallway, staring out the window. January, a gray parking lot, naked oak trees. Andrew sat next to her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just sat shoulder to shoulder with her. And that was all she needed. The bailiff called them back in. The judge did not waste time with preamble. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Elena Carter. The condominium shall remain the sole and exclusive property of the plaintiff. The defendant, Gregory Vance, is entitled to a cash buyout equivalent to 20% of the current market equity, reflecting his initial capital investment, and limited mortgage contributions. The 401k accounts remain separate property. This ruling is final. Greg stood up, his mouth opening to argue. Elena couldn't hear what he said. The blood was rushing in her ears. The judge banged her gavel. The ruling is final. Counsel, control your client. Paul Richards packed his leather briefcase with the calm efficiency of a man who expects to win but doesn't let it go to his head. He gave Elena a single nod. We're done here. They walked out into the corridor. Greg was standing by the water fountain. His young attorney had already vanished. Down the stairwell, Chrissy was nowhere to be seen. She had severed ties weeks ago. Greg stood there, staring out the window, and the entire architecture of his shoulders had collapsed. He looked smaller, older than he had in November. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized that the safety net he had spent years relying on had quietly been unclipped. Elena stopped. She thought she would feel a rush of vindication, triumph, spite, or perhaps even pity, any of the standard human emotions Hollywood tells you to expect at the climax of a revenge arc. She felt nothing, nothing but the sensation of turning the final page of a very long, very exhausting book. Goodbye, Greg, she said, her voice perfectly even. He turned and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't anticipated. Absolute bewilderment. Not rage, not bitterness. Just raw confusion, as if he genuinely couldn't comprehend how he had ended up here, standing alone in a municipal hallway, stripped of his leverage, stripped of his narrative. Elena didn't wait for him to speak. She turned her back and walked toward the Procendry elevators, where Andrew was holding the doors open for her. The criminal proceedings against Greg and Chrissy wrapped up months later. Well, after the wedding, Paul relayed the outcome via a brief phone call. Plea deals for both, suspended sentences, and heavy probation. Chrissy was permanently stripped of her nursing license by the state medical board. Greg lost his job in medical sales. In that industry, an indictment for fraud makes you radioactive. Chrissy left him the minute the legal fees started piling up, a quiet, rapid exit typical of people who always keep one foot out the door. Greg ended up renting a cheap studio apartment out by the interstate. Elena heard about it through the grapevine. Nancy had heard it from a mutual acquaintance. Elena listened, nodded, and changed the subject. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate his ruin. His storyline had simply ceased to be part of her universe. She was busy living her own. On January 26th, at 11 a.m., they got married. Elena wore a simple ivory dress, not a ball gown, just something elegant that fit her perfectly. Andrew wore a dark, tailored suit. He always dressed with lethal precision and zero excess. This time, the clerk at City Hall was an older woman with kind eyes who read the civil vows with a warm, steady voice, clearly still finding joy in her job. After all these years, I now pronounce you husband and wife. They exchanged simple gold bands. No diamonds, no custom engravings. They had picked them out at a jeweler downtown in under 20 minutes because neither of them required extravagant symbols to validate a contract they had already signed in their minds. Andrew looked down at her. Serious, quiet. Thank you for trusting me, he said. Elena looked up at him. Thank you for nodding, she replied. The clerk behind the plexiglass clearly had no idea what they were talking about, but she smiled warmly anyway. That evening, they spent the night alone at the brownstone. Andrew cooked dinner. Nothing Michelin-starred, nothing theatrical, just pan-seared chicken, wild rice, and a green salad. He moved around the kitchen with the fluid confidence of a man entirely comfortable in his domain. Elena sat at the marble island, watching him. "You could hire a private chef," she noted. "With your portfolio, you could have a team of them." "I could." He didn't turn around. "But you're cooking. I enjoy it." Cooking for someone else engages a completely different part of the people brain than cooking for survival. "I think I just figured that out." Elena stared at the broad line of his shoulders. "Andrew?" "Yes." "Are you happy?" He turned off the stove, wiped his hands on a towel, and turned around. He looked at her for a long time. The kind of look reserved for a question that demands an excavated truth, not a reflex. "I haven't used that word in my internal vocabulary for 11 years, he finally said. "I think the circuit's rusted over. I almost forgot how to identify the metric." He paused. "But yes, I believe I am." Elena smiled. 2 taper candles burned on the island. Not for forced romance, the pendant light, above the counter, had started flickering that morning, and Andrew hadn't had time to replace the bulb. So Elena had dug candles out of a drawer. The flames leaned whenever one of them moved. Outside the massive windows, the January city glowed. Blue-shadowed snowdrifts, amber street lamps. Elena thought about the math of it all. 1 year ago, exactly, she had been married to Greg. 8 years of split mortgages, the mug on the bottom shelf, his recliner dominating the living room. The text message on the morning of her 2 more removal. And now, here she was. The candles, the quiet brownstone, the man standing across the marble counter who had just admitted, "I believe I am," with the careful reverence of a man, afraid that if he spoke too loudly, he might shatter the illusion. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how bizarre the physics of time is," she said. "A year ago, I didn't know you existed. And today, you are the only human being on this planet I actually feel like myself around. Is that incredibly fast? Or incredibly slow? Depends on where you start the stopwatch," he said. She looked at him. He was right. Depends on where you start the stopwatch. If you started in that hospital room in November, it was a terrifyingly fast sprint. If you started at the beginning of his 11 years of silence and her 8 years of waiting, it was an agonizingly slow marathon. They had both crawled through miles of broken glass to end up at this kitchen island, eating chicken and rice by candlelight. But they made it. "We made it," she said out loud. "What?" He paused with his fork. "Nothing. Just thinking out loud. I'm used to it," he said. And in those 4 words, there was such an overwhelming current of quiet devotion that Elena had to look down at her plate. Outside, January was ending. Soon it would be February, then March, and then spring, which in Ohio always arrived 3 weeks late and with a bad attitude. But it always arrived. Elena didn't map out a 5-year plan. She simply thought, tomorrow morning, I will wake up, I will walk into this kitchen, and he will either be here or he will walk through that door in exactly 1 minute, and there will be coffee and the geranium on the sill and an entire, utterly ordinary day ahead of me. For now, that was enough. It was everything. The first thing that changed after the wedding was absolutely nothing. It was jarring, yet profoundly comforting. Elena had half expected some massive psychological shift, as if a heavy breaker switch had been thrown, and reality would instantly reboot. The switch never flipped. The mornings remained identical. He vanished into his office at 6:30 a.m. She drank coffee by the date window. The geranium bloomed. Their silent breakfast at 7:30. Her thinking out loud. He started bringing her a physical copy of the New York Times every morning from the corner bodega. She asked him why. He said, "You strike me as a person who requires the tactile sensation of newsprint." She did. The shift was microscopic. Previously, when she lived in the brownstone, there had always been a faint hum of impermanence. Not discomfort, just a subconscious awareness of, "I am a guest here." That hum finally powered down. The floorboard that groaned in the hallway simply became our groaning floorboard. His habit of aggressively reorganizing the pantry when he was stressed became just another quirk of the man she lived with. She stopped mentally cataloging objects as his ennemi. That, she realized, is what it actually means to become an us. In February, Andrew fully rebooted his empire. Elena realized that for the last few months, he had been operating in safe mode, executing the bare minimum, maintaining his portfolios, taking board calls, but lacking the aggressive, kinetic fire that was clearly his default state. He had kept his engine idling so he could focus on her. Now, the fire was back. He worked late into the night, video conferences with Silicon Valley, endless legal reviews, high-stakes negotiations. Sometimes she would fall asleep to the low, steady baritone of his voice bleeding through the office wall, calm, authoritative, dictating terms. She'd wake up at 2 a.m., wander into the kitchen, and find him at the island, illuminated by the harsh glow of his MacBook, nursing a cold coffee. "Are you ever going to sleep?" she'd ask. "Give me 1 hour." "You said 1 hour 3 hours ago. This is a different hour." She would roll her eyes and go back to bed. He would slip under the covers, 90 minutes later, but there was a vibrant energy in his exhaustion now. Not the hollow burnout of a man grinding away to avoid his own thoughts, but the electric momentum of a man building something new. One night over dinner, he set his fork down. "I'm launching a philanthropic fund." Elena looked up. "A grant foundation to cover post-operative rehabilitation and at-home care for patients recovering from major surgeries," he said carefully. He spoke with the quote, measured caution of a man pitching something deeply personal. "I watched you recover. If I hadn't been there, the insurance policy covers the surgeon and the OR. That's it. After discharge, a patient is completely abandoned. No physical therapy stipends, no meal deliveries, no psychological support. That's where the actual survival happens." Elena stared at him. "That is an infrastructural nightmare. It will cost tens of millions of dollars. I know. You have the network and the capital to actually launch it?" "I do." "Then launch it." He looked at her as if bracing for a counter-argument. Why are you doing this? Or do you know what kind of liability you're taking on?" "Non came. The Second Chance Foundation," he said. "That's the working title." "It's a perfect title," Elena said simply. He nodded, looking past her toward the window, and Elena watched the micro-expressions on his face soften. The tension drained out of his jaw. It happens when a person finally hears the exact validation they were desperate for. and is staggered by how effortlessly it was freely given. She returned to her classroom in mid-February. Dr. Sterling cleared her for light-duty sedentary work, absolutely no lifting playground equipment or breaking up fights. The principal, Mrs. Davis, greeted her in the main office with an expression that was equal parts ecstatic and terrified that Elena had returned too soon. "Your second graders have been utterly feral without you," she warned. Elena opened the door to room 2B, a split second of dead silence. The children's brains lagged as they processed the visual input, then chaos. Not an organized greeting, but the explosive, uncontainable shriek of 7-year-olds who lacked the vocabulary to express relief and substitute it with sheer volume. Chloe, whose shoelaces were miraculously double-knotted for the occasion, bolted up first. Tommy knocked his pencil box onto the linoleum. Danny, abandoning his deeply entrenched stance on dinosaur supremacy, sprinted across the reading rug and slammed into Elena's waist, hugging her with the terrifying grip of a child who had genuinely feared she was gone forever. Elena stood in the center of the chaos, holding her ground. She held it together for exactly 90 seconds, right up until Chloe looked up at her with deadly seriousness and said, "Mrs. Carter, the substitute didn't even know how to do the phonics song." That broke her. Elena blinked hard, laughed a wet, shaky laugh, ruffled Danny's hair, and said, all right, I'm here. Everyone back to your desks. Let's get to work." That evening at the brownstone, she recounted the ambush to Andrew. He sat across the island, listening, her. With that intense, hyper-focused gaze she had learned to read as absolute presence. And as she talked, she watched the ice in him continue to melt. Slowly, the way a frozen lake gives way in late March when the sun finally finds its teeth. "You love those kids," he noted. "I really do," she nodded. "It shows. When you talk about them, you light up in a way that, I don't know." "What?" He went quiet. "I enjoy listening to it. I haven't heard a human being talk passionately about something they genuinely love in over a decade." Elena looked at him. She thought about Vera. 11 years was a brutal sentence. To serve. In the dark, she reached her hand across the marble and covered his hand. A quick, firm press, just like the hospital ward. He didn't pull away. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. They sat like that while the city buzzed. Below them, in April, Elena bought a pregnancy test at a CVS. She had been agonizing over it for days. Her cycle was 2 weeks late, but she had aggressively rationalized it away. Stress, the lingering trauma of the anesthesia, her body recalibrating. Dr. Sterling had warned her that ovarian surgery could throw her endocrine system into chaos for up to 6 months. But one morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, stared at her own reflection, and an internal alarm bell finally bypassed her logic. Take the test. She bought a 2-pack on her way home from the elementary school. Andrew was still at the office. She walked into the master bathroom, locked the door, followed the instructions, set a timer on her phone for 3 minutes, and stared at the porcelain sink. The alarm chimed. She looked at the plastic stick. 1 pink line. Then, unmistakable and glaring, a 2nd pink line. She opened the 2nd box, repeated the process, and got the exact same result. Elena unlocked the bathroom door, walked into the living room, and sat heavily on the sofa, clutching the plastic stick. Her brain was completely blank. No words, no sentences, just a massive, monolithic wave of emotion that refused to fit into any recognizable psychological container. Dr. Sterling had told her Pregnancy is highly viable, but it will require aggressive monitoring. Adhesions aren't a death sentence for fertility, but it's a high-risk game. He had delivered the data clinically, and she had nodded, thinking, okay, we'll monitor it eventually. She hadn't calculated it happening this fast. She sat there clutching the stick, thinking, I am terrified. Not because she didn't want it. She wanted it. She had been begging the universe for this for 8 years, and that was precisely why she was terrified. Because here it was, the actual, physical manifestation of everything she had prayed for. And what if the front door unlocked? Andrew walked in, shrugged off his suit jacket, set his leather briefcase by the console, and saw her on the sofa. Elena didn't say a word. She simply raised her hand, holding out the plastic stick. He froze. He didn't take off his shoes. He walked slowly across the hardwood, took the plastic stick from her trembling fingers, and stared at the 2 pink lines. A heavy, absolute silence engulfed the room. He stared at the test. Elena stared at him. Then, very slowly, his knees buckled. He sank onto the sofa next to her, as if the structural integrity of his legs had simply evaporated. Is this accurate? He whispered. The second one is on the bathroom counter. It says the same thing, she said, her voice shaking. He looked at her, and then he grabbed her. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping both arms around her back, burying his face in her hair. He held her with a desperate, crushing pressure, the way a man grips a lifeline he thought he had lost in the dark. She felt the rhythm of his breathing fracture. He wasn't hyperventilating, but his chest heaved with deep, shuddering intakes of oxygen. The sound of a dam finally giving way. She buried her face in his shoulder. I'm so scared, she choked out. I know, he said, his voice thick. I am too. It's terrifying. But it's a good fear, he said, holding her tighter. For the first time in 11 years, Elena, it is a good fear. Andrew mutated. Not overnight, but gradually, as the weeks stacked into months. He bypassed her standard HMO OB-GYN and booked an appointment with the top maternal fetal medicine specialist in the state. He didn't ask her permission. He just said, tomorrow, 10 a.m. She tried to argue that her school district insurance covered a perfectly fine clinic down the street. He shot her a look that communicated with terrifying clarity that this was not up for debate. He attended every single ultrasound. He sat in sterile waiting rooms on cheap, plastic chairs, holding a paper ticket with a number, scrolling through emails, on his phone. There were other husbands and boyfriends in those waiting rooms. Some looked bored. Some brought bodega flowers. Andrew spoke to absolutely no one. He operated like a bodyguard awaiting an extraction. The first ultrasound was at 8 weeks. The technician, a calm woman in blue scrubs, navigated the wand and pointed to a cluster of gray static on the brain monitor. A tiny, pulsating flicker, and then she hit a button, and the room filled with the rapid, galloping drumbeat of a fetal heart. Andrew was standing near the head of the examination table. Elena watched his face. It wasn't a cinematic breakdown. A single muscle in his jaw jumped, and something ancient and jagged behind his eyes seemed to splinter. The doctor kept talking developmental milestones, crown to rump measurements, prenatal vitamins. Elena nodded and tracked the data. Andrew remained completely mute. When they walked out of the clinic and into the hallway, he stopped dead by a massive pane of reinforced glass overlooking the parking garage. He just stood there, Staring out at the concrete and the gray April clouds, Elena walked up and stood beside him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, refusing to turn his head. "I was in a room exactly like that once, and it ended horrifically. I remember that sound. The heartbeat. It was there. And then, one day it wasn't. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't say, 'That won't happen this time.' She reached out and locked her fingers through his, gripping his hand with everything she had. 'I am standing right here,' she said fiercely, 'and I am not going anywhere.'" He finally turned and looked at her, a long, analyzing gaze, searching for a fracture in her armor, and finding none. "I know," he said. "I believe you." For a man who trusted nothing but data, it was the greatest concession of his life. Mia was born in October. The autumn was unusually warm. Indian summer had dug its heels in, stretching deep into the month. When Elena's contractions spiked, the maples outside the fort in Elena's contractions spiked. Hospital windows were blazing orange, and the late afternoon sun was cutting long, golden geometric shadows across the asphalt. Andrew was in the delivery room. He had informed the hospital administration of his intent to be present, and given his tax bracket, no one offered a Prue's counterargument. He stood at the head of the bed. He gripped her hand. He didn't panic, didn't pace, didn't offer stupid breathing advice he had read on WebMD. He functioned as an anchor, periodically dropping his voice to a low rumble near her ear. "You're doing great. I've got you. Focus on me." Elena's memory of the actual labor fractured into abstract sensory inputs. Blinding pain. The vice grip of his hand. The aggressive encouragement of the plast attending physician. Searing white LED lights hitting the ceiling tiles. And then a horrific pressure, followed by a scream. Mia announced her arrival instantly, with the lung capacity of an air raid siren. Andrew was still holding Elena's hand, and she felt his fingers suddenly crush hers. Not in fear, in absolute shock. She looked up at him. A single tear was cutting a clean track down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't even realize it was falling. His eyes were locked on the writhing, blood-streaked bundle the pediatric nurse was hastily swaddling. In a striped blanket, Elena looked at his face and saw the entire topography of his life collapse and rebuild itself in real time. 11 years of an empty penthouse. The phantom, echoes of an ultrasound machine a decade ago. The cold, sterile boardrooms. And this violently loud, screaming, living reality. The nurse handed Mia to him. He took her clumsily. A man who managed billion-dollar hedge funds, suddenly, terrified of breaking a 7-pound human. He cradled her awkwardly, treating her neck like unexploded ordnance. He looked down at her. Mia blinked her swollen eyelids and suddenly stopped, screaming. Andrew stared at his daughter. Elena stared at Andrew, and in his eyes, she saw an expression so utterly defenseless, so entirely stripped of his corporate armor, it took her breath away. As if the titanium blast doors he had built around his chest 11 years ago had just been blown off their hinges by 3 kilograms of squirming human biology. "Hi," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Mia, we've been waiting for you for a very long time." They bought a house in the suburbs the following spring. A 20-minute commute from the city, a massive, historic colonial with a wraparound porch and an overgrown, chaotic backyard. There was an apple orchard that had gone feral, a grown slashed-at groats, few weeping cherries, and an impenetrable wall of lilac bushes along the Proston property line. "We can hire a landscaping crew to rip it all out and sod it," Andrew had suggested during the inspection. Absolutely not, Elena vetoed. I know how to. Prune apple trees. I'll fix it. Then I will learn how to prune apple trees, he conceded. By the time the weather broke, Mia had mastered the art of high-speed crawling. She operated like a tactical drone, moving silently, with no predetermined flight, path, materializing under sofas, yanking on power cords, and attempting to breach the lower kitchen cabinets. One Saturday in late April, the temperature spiked. The feral apple orchard erupted into a violent canopy of white blossoms, looking like a low-hanging cloud bank trapped in the backyard. Elena was standing on the cedar deck, a mug of coffee in her hand, staring out at the blooming trees. Andrew pushed open the screen door and stepped onto the deck. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just held her the casual, unprompted embrace of a man who finally feels at home in his own life. They stood there listening. From inside the living room came the muffled shriek of Mia's laughter. She had clearly discovered something highly dangerous and was thrilled about it. "What's on your mind?" he murmured against her neck. "The math," Elena said, her eyes tracking the falling apple blossoms. "1.5 years ago, I took an Uber to Mercy General by myself, and my biggest existential panic was wondering who was going to teach my second graders how to conjugate verbs if I died on the table." She leaned back into his chest. "And now I have all of this. It's a lot of variables," he agreed quietly. "It's everything," she corrected him. "Andrew, I am terrified of this ever-ending." He went perfectly still. He didn't offer a cheap, "It's never going to end." "I promise. Then we will engineer it so it doesn't," he said. "We will put in the work, every single day." He didn't promise her magic. He promised her relentless effort. And Elena realized that was the most romantic, bulletproof vow a man like him could ever make. The screen door banged open. Mia scrambled out onto the cedar deck. She didn't crawl. She executed a terrifyingly fast commando scramble, locking onto her target with the absolute certainty of a heat-seeking missile. The target was her father. She slammed into his shin, grabbed the fabric of his jeans, hauled herself up onto her wobbly legs, and stared up at him with enormous steel-gray eyes. Her entire posture demanded an immediate status report. Andrew groaned, bent down, and scooped her up. He was still slightly awkward with her, treating her with the exaggerated caution of a man who knows exactly how fragile the universe can be. The second she was at eye level, Mia lunged forward and clamped her tiny fist over his nose. Hard. "Ow," Andrew said flatly. Mia squeezed harder, her knuckles turning white. "She does that every single time you pick her up," Elena pointed out, taking a sip of her coffee. "I am aware. It appears to be her primary mechanism for establishing dominance." "Well, she's established it," Elena smiled. "You can. Let go of his nose now, Mia." Mia looked at her mother. Then she looked back at her father, and she threw her head back and let out a loud, chaotic, joyous shriek of laughter, simply because the sun was hitting the deck, the apple trees were blooming, and she was holding the face of the man holding her. Andrew blinked, and then he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a real, involuntary, chest-deep laugh that startled even him. Elena leaned against the railing, watching the two of them, and felt a sensation expand in her chest that was so massive she couldn't attach a word to it. She just laughed with them. The apple trees snowed white petals onto the lawn. April sun bleached the cedar deck. Mia maintained a death grip on her billionaire father's nose and shrieked with joy. Sometimes, life flatlines exactly where you thought the story was over, purely to force you to start writing a new one. Elena knew that now. As an absolute, undeniable fact,